first at hand's command.
Britain, in the second half of the 18th century, bestrode the globe. Enormously rich, enormously powerful. But what we failed to produce during this time was a national composer of real genius. We were, however, and continue to be, a nation of anthem lovers. We British naturally create songs that we can all wrap our lungs around, which tap into the public mood and somehow draw us together.
Like it or loathe it, Rule Britannia has been a firm part of British national identity since the 1740s, the decade that also saw the birth of our other big national tune. So, two iconic tunes, but no great national composer. And once again, the man that became our national musical hero at the end of the 18th century was, like Handel before him, a foreigner. He came from Austria, and his name was Franz Joseph Haydn. And he wrote this. The Austrian imperial anthem, subsequently adopted by the Germans. Let's face it, they got the better tune. But Britain's relationship with Haydn really was a two-way street. We caused a seismic shift in his composition, and he took our musical destiny forwards. Haydn arrived in Britain on New Year's Day 1791, the first of two substantial visits he made here. He was already revered internationally as the world's greatest composer, and yet he'd spent his entire working life closeted away in the service of noble princes on the Hungarian border. And only now, at the age of nearly 60, did he have the opportunity to travel independently. The world was his oyster, but it was Britain he chose to come to. In 1791, this country was more progressive, open, free, and rich than any other in Europe. And interestingly, economic, political, and cultural power was in the process of shifting from the aristocracy and the church to the new, confident and swelling middle class. It's really important to realise that Haydn was massively popular in Britain long before he'd even come here. We knew him through his scores, through his symphonies and his quartets, which were being endlessly performed around the country. This is an age, of course, before recording, so it wasn't like Haydn's discs were travelling. It was his scores that were travelling, and we were loving them. Now, as a conductor, I'm endlessly being confronted by new music, and I so clearly remember the day about 15 years ago when I finally, suddenly got hold of the Farewell Symphony, Haydn's Symphony No. 45. And do you know what? I opened the first page of this score. It's in F-sharp minor, by the way, which is a really prickly, dodgy key, a key that was very rarely used by composers of this era because of its instability. I opened the page, and it just jumped out at me, practically grabbed my throat off. It's so powerful. It starts with this stunningly strong set of chords thundering down and then back up again, and then goes to something abjectly soft. Haydn had a tremendous sense of theatre. He was a great teller of stories, and we British have always loved that. So So I suppose the key to this music, why we loved it so much, is this sense of drama, of storytelling. Also this tremendous sense of forward motion. There's something immensely optimistic about that. The earth elemental power of the rhythmic drive, even though the outer kind of tenor of the music, it's a minor key, is quite sombre.
Late 18th century Britain had an insatiable appetite for thrilling, spectacular entertainment. Fortunes were being made and lost in enterprises such as extravagant masquerade balls, the famous Oxford Street Pantheon, which functioned as a kind of winter pleasure gardens, and the mind-blowing novelty of Robert Barker's Rotunda, which opened just here in 1793 on the corner of Cranbourne Street and Leicester Square, and which for 5 shillings offered the public the Georgian equivalent of the IMAX cinema. A gigantic 360-degree view of exotic cities like Constantinople, stirring patriotic scenes from the British fleet, or battles from the Napoleonic Wars. Now, just a couple of years before Robert Barker opened his Rotunda, a violinist and impresario by the name of Johann Peter Salomon determined that Haydn's name should be up there in lights, so to speak, in Britain's capital.
Marshal Marcus is the nearest modern equivalent to Salomon. Formerly a violinist, a self-confessed Haydn nut, he's now head of music at London's South Bank Centre.
Huge coup, wasn't it, for London to get Haydn?
It was, and it's one of those things that rest on almost like an accident, that Salomon, impresario who worked in London, happened to be travelling around in Europe. He was in Cologne when he heard the news that the prince who'd employed Haydn was dead, and he went straight to Vienna. I mean, it was one of those moments where you just got to do it. You know, he thought, yeah, there's the opportunity. He went to Vienna, he went to see Haydn, and he said, Haydn, you're coming with me to London. And they sort of made this accord, as he put it, and he brought them here. And it was just, you know, an extraordinary opportunity. We all look for those.
Why do you think London was so attractive to Haydn?
Well, this is the world's table at that point. Everything is going on here. So it was an extraordinary magnet for musicians. It's been that for hundreds of years, and it continues today to be that. And huge potential for earning. I mean, the contract that was done with him, he got £200 for a commission to write 6 symphonies and £200 more for the copyright there, £250 for a benefit. I think I estimated that he was offered in the region of £1,200, which was a massive sum in those days. London was the centre of what was important. Music was the rage, Haydn was the man, London was the place.
London hit Haydn like a sledgehammer. It was the busiest, the noisiest, the dirtiest, the most industrialised city on the planet. And Haydn made sense of it by trying to understand it, compulsively collecting data. Like this, for instance, he wrote, "The City of London consumes 8 times 100,000 cartloads of coal each year. Each cart holds 30. In the month of January 1792, a roasting chicken costs 7 shillings, a turkey 9 shillings, a dozen larks 1. The national debt of England is estimated to be over 200 million. The City of London keeps 4,000 carts for an apprentice generally works the whole year round from 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the evening, and during this time he is paid by the piece, but every quarter of an hour of absence is docked. NB, a duck, if it's plucked, costs 5 shillings. Cool and clinical collections of information. This is how Haydn's mind works, his sense of London, his sense of industrialisation. So what does it tell us about the man, and in particular, his music? Look, of course he's interested in the poetical, but he's most interested in form and structure.
He's already perfected his art by the 1760s, 70s, decades before he's come to London. And now he's just going to go and enjoy himself. I mean, let's take the 71 number 2, the string quartet, that first movement, and you've got this very slow opening, and it sounds very portentous, very serious. then immediately after a few bars, he just punctures that. And he starts what you wouldn't even call as a tune, really. It's sort of this jumping figure. Bum, 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 bum. And then you think, OK, now what's he going to do with it? And of course, he does all sorts of things with it. He puts it upside down, he covers it in as an accompaniment, he makes the harmony go into some bizarre places. And it's so interesting that many composers go into a sort of late phase when it all gets very, very serious. But Haydn just has a technique that allows him to go to the edge and come back. The number of times you get to a point you think, oh God, now it's getting serious, and you expect a sort of Beethoven crisis. And he says, no, no, just joking, and he moves on.
This is where he's such a scientist, that he's got the same kind of zealous need to discover all the which ways that one might treat or work a piece of music, a thread, just as an alchemist might in a laboratory.
I think that's absolutely right. That's exactly how I see Haydn. He's one of those people who is forever looking at the structure of the world and saying, OK, what happens if we turn that upside down there, or that way round? And I just think it's that constant curiosity. You know, his tunes are not the things that will catch you. It's the form, it's the structure. I was once talking to a musician who said to me, you know, the thing about Haydn is the structure is the expression. And I think that was one of the most profound things I've heard about him.
But Haydn was here to deliver. He needed to make an impact with that structure and form. Early George in London had got its greatest thrills from the dramatic narrative spectacular of opera. But the public of the 1790s was about to be ravished by the entirely abstract musical spectacle of the symphony. And over the next 4 years, Haydn, fondly dubbed the father of the symphony, was to write a dozen of them, those that we now know as the London Symphonies. Together, they represent not only the real crown jewels of his output, but also his single greatest public achievement in this country. And of all of them, the one that the British public most completely wowed to was his Symphony No. 100, the Military.
In March 1791, Salomon launched Haydn onto the London scene with a 12-week series of subscription concerts in the Hanover Square Rooms, which was sadly destroyed in 1900. So, for this film, we're performing in the closest match you can find, the Assembly Rooms in Bath, with my orchestra of period instruments, Army of Generals.
These were high prestige, fashionable events, and they were expensive. 5 guineas or so for 12 concerts was typical for a series like that, and that's a lot of money. London audiences made their presence felt, whether it was through ecstatic applause, even during the middle of a piece. But if the music didn't take their fancy, they would engage in conversation and go off to the refreshment rooms. The composer had to really work hard to attract the attention of his audiences.
The demanding British public presented a distinct new challenge for Haydn. He's now effectively a commercial composer. And like the best showman, he's got to grab the attention of his paying audience from the very start. The Holywell Music Room in Oxford is Europe's oldest purpose-built concert hall. And back in the 1790s, audiences here wanted to be gripped even by smaller scale works. Now, Haydn is a master of starting with a bang. How about this for an opening gambit?
Or this. And what about this? And for me, it's that combination in Haydn of both showman and scientist that chimes so perfectly with the appetite and nature of the British in the 1790s.
This is the Royal Institution of Great Britain, which was founded in the 1790s for the advancement and the promulgation of science. And its public meetings were so popular that very often the street was literally crammed with carriages, which is why this road, Albemarle Street, was London's first one-way street. What's the purpose of this great theatrical space?
This is the main lecture theatre of the Royal Institution that's been here more or less since the beginning, and it's where we entertain the public with science.
I'm desperate to hear about the experiment, you know, famously caricatured by Gilray, that took place in this very room, didn't it?
Yes, it happened probably about 1801, and basically it shows Thomas Garnett, who was Professor of Chemistry here, administering laughing gas to Sir John Hippersley, and showing Hippersley farting.
So what did laughing gas actually do? It didn't make you fart, did it?
It didn't make you fart, no, but it did make you laugh, and it was very enjoyable. Davy in Bristol, where he discovered its properties, was a friend of Coleridge and Southey, the sort of poets and philosophers, and he tested it out on them, and they basically, in Coleridge's case, certainly added it to his repertoire of recreational drugs. Davy was a romantic, he wrote poetry, and he was the most engaging of lecturers because he did the most dangerous things that you could possibly imagine. So he would explode chemicals, he'd do anything to attract an audience, because even today, when we have school children coming to lectures in this lecture theatre, the thing that really gets them excited is seeing an explosion.
To what extent were they trying to show the common person that science was something that they could understand?
Well, I think the Royal Institution was not meant for the common person. I mean, it cost 5 guineas to belong to the Royal Institution, which is about £500 or £600.
That's exactly what it costed if you wanted to buy a subscription to a series of concerts that Salomon and Haydn were giving in London.
That tells you what class they were, the proprietors were aiming at.
Haydn hit London a bit like a chemical explosion. Can you sense what it was about Haydn that so inflamed the public appetite?
I think when Haydn arrived, it was 2 years after the French Revolution, and by that time it was becoming increasingly clear that there would have to be a war against France. And indeed, halfway through Haydn's visit to London, Britain did indeed go to war. And so there was, in some classes at any rate, there was an overwhelming patriotism that saw in Haydn music that could be employed for patriotic purposes.
The Times gave a very vivid description of the first performance. Encore, encore resounded from every seat. The ladies themselves could not forbear. It is the advancing to battle and the march of men, the sounding of the charge, the clash of arms, the groans of the wounded, and what may well be called the hellish roar of war.
I think he's also a hit, though, because there is a growing sort of seriousness. And the notion that a concert is just a party, is just entertainment, he caters for that side, but he also caters for those who want to delve further. He's a great entertainer, but he's also a great learner.
It wasn't all plain sailing, though. From Haydn's diaries and notebooks, we know that he found the sheer cacophony of this city difficult. The noise that the common people make as they sell their wares in the street is intolerable. When Haydn first came to London, he lodged with Salomon in a house on this spot, number 18 Great Pulteney Street. And just over on the other side of the road was the most famous piano maker in London, Broadwood's. And bizarrely, Haydn started composing in a room at the back of the shop. Imagine the noise, piano tuning, piano selling. So he's grappling with the cacophony of London life on every level. But he's also encountering a far more wonderful sound, that of Georgian Britain's most exciting and most modern piece of musical technology.
At Finchcock's Musical Museum in Kent, I heard for myself the extraordinary differences between continental and British pianos of the day.
Howard, this is kind of the instrument that Haydn would have known before he came to Britain.
Exactly. This is a Viennese forte piano, literally loud, soft, and that's exactly what it does, but in a very sophisticated way. It's got two knee levers that change the quality of sound. The one on the left makes the dampers lift off the strings, so it's like a harp. Everything resonates in a very sweet way. And the one on the right is called a modulator pedal, where a felt comes between the hammer and the string.
So this is a veritable Viennese jewel, a wonderful series of kind of pearl-like droplets of sound. Over here, on the other hand, we have this magnificent protein-rich beast, which is the British piano.
Yep, this is a Broadwood, which is exactly the same type of piano that Haydn would have had when he came to London. And it's bigger, it's louder, it's more dangerous and experimental. It's got two levers, which are now called pedals. There's a sustaining pedal. And then you've got the una corda pedal, because most of the keys have 3 strings. And as you put it down further and further, it can get quieter and quieter. Like Haydn, I think in the morning, he would get up and improvise on the piano. So I could imagine him finding a new piano and being so excited, playing lots of big chords. And then getting so excited by that, he wants to find the opposite. So maybe putting the new una corda pedal down, and then suddenly... Well, I think the credit to the Broadwood factory is that it's so advanced in its technology. They're really trying to push the piano forward. And composers were asking for that all the time. It's kind of gone are the days of just going... It's like you can feel that there's more to give here, and by Haydn's time you might have... and then suddenly the whole orchestra joins in. And I think that the makers and the composers were working in tandem, really.
Haydn's time in Britain exposed him to something he'd never have seen on mainland Europe. A composer celebrated as national icon. Handel, master of public spectaculars, creator of the oratorio. Haydn witnessed the king himself rise to his feet for the Hallelujah Chorus in one of the mammoth festivals of Handel's music that took place each year at Westminster Abbey. But at another extreme, the British public mingled music with more hedonistic delights in the pleasure gardens of cities like Bath, Tunbridge and London.
They say there is an echo here, they say there is an echo here. I'll try, I'll try, I'll try. They say there is an echo here.
In 1781, the popular hit of the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens was this little number. about an invisible echo calling for its tea.
Your hands you give, your hands is big, you'll find it by and by. That's it, that's it, that's it, they do, they've hit it to a T. T, the echo calls for tea is very droll.
10 years later, its composer was to have a profound resonance in Haydn's life.
It seems to me no humour to cram, as a hill to live it calls for ham.
This is Herschel's house, and from here he pretty much ran the music scene in Bath. He taught, he composed, and he arranged the concerts at the assembly rooms. He was a very successful musician and impresario. In fact, one of the great figures in the musical life of late 18th century Britain. But music making was only half of Herschel's life. In the daytime, he'd be making music up there, but as night fell, he'd come down here to the bowels of the building.
In this little room behind the kitchen, Herschel would spend night after night grinding mirrors of the highest optical quality in order to create the most sophisticated telescopes of his age.
Herschel spent many hours in this little back garden with his telescopes, often in the bitter cold, observing the night sky. And on one such night, the 13th of March 1781, he made his big discovery, the unfortunately named planet Uranus. There's a man with a telescope in a field. Hi, Chris.
Hiya, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Look, the first thing I've got to ask you is, how significant was it that Herschel discovered a new planet?
Well, I think it was the most significant discovery of his century and several since. You see, for the whole of human history, the ancient Greeks, everyone knew there were 6 planets, the Earth and the 5 that you can see with the naked eye moving amongst the stars. And suddenly Herschel, with his giant telescope, adds not just a new star, not just a new fuzzy patch, but a new world to what we knew about the cosmos.
Haydn comes to Britain, and he's heard of this celebrated astronomer, the man who's discovered Uranus, and of course he's dead keen to see him, and finally the two do meet. What do you think Herschel would have shown him?
Well, I'm sure they talked about music, but I have this image as well of Haydn being led out the back of Herschel's house and into the observatory and shown these enormous telescopes with which Herschel was making his name.
Well, Haydn was clearly absolutely, I mean, he marvelled at the actual sight of the telescope itself, let alone what he could see through it.
And at the cost of it. He wrote down in his diary about how expensive this thing was and how much Herschel was making as a telescope maker. So there's clearly some mercenary. Maybe that's what they talked about. Maybe everything we've been imagining is ridiculous and they sat and compared bank statements for an hour or two. I'm sure they will have pored over Herschel's star maps, his drawings, probably the page with Uranus carefully sketched in. You can imagine the book being opened and passed round along with the scores. And perhaps they stood there on a rainy, miserable night like this, and Herschel maybe told Haydn what he wanted to show him. And maybe I should do the same. I wanted to show you an object called the Orion Nebula. You can see it with the naked eye. It's a faint, misty patch. Herschel was the first to realise that this is a place where stars are being born. Perhaps he stood there talking to Haydn, saying, well, I can show you where our solar system came from.
Was Haydn's depiction of the beginnings of our universe, many years later, the legacy in sound from that encounter with Herschel? Its extraordinary zero-gravity harmony takes us to the edge of the known musical universe. This is radical music.
Herschel's career seems to me to be about expansions. You start with the solar system that we know, and he adds a planet to it. He doesn't remove the solar system, we add something. Haydn was religious. Herschel was a religious man as well, so these discoveries aren't challenging God or the established religion at all. But it's a grander universe for God to have created and for astronomers and musicians to play in, I suppose.
In 1792, Haydn's first British visit came to an end, and he returned home to Austria for just over a year. The son of a rural wheelwright, Haydn had trained as a choir boy at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. In his 20s, he'd gone into service with the Esterhazy family in the small town of Eisenstadt, 30 miles southeast of Vienna. The magnificent Esterhazy Palace was to prove the perfect laboratory for the young composer's extraordinary talents.
So, Walter, am I imagining Haydn walking to work along this corridor every day?
He did, yeah. He wasn't living in the palace, but this was his workshop. So to be there twice a day, speaking with the prince to get the wishes from him, what kind of music he wants to hear or what he has to prepare.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then he rehearsed here with the musicians.
He's rehearsing in this room?
In this room and maybe rooms next to this, so...
Oh, my goodness. Oh, God. This is some adventure playground. Unbelievable.
Yeah. I always say this is Haydn's Graceland.
Yeah. And you can hear, the most beautiful acoustic.
It wasn't like this, the acoustic, because the wood wasn't here.
Okay.
When he came in here, so he found this place, yeah? Wonderful hall, big hall.
With a marble floor, though?
With the marble floor, and this is not so good for acoustic conditions. So he asked the prince to put logs, wood on it, so that it's better for it. And now we find even the bills of the carpenters who did this in 1761. So Haydn asked for conditions to have the perfect situation. Like I said, it was a workshop for him. So you said, wow, when you came in here, yeah? So maybe Haydn did this well, and he had to compose symphonies for the prince. There were no symphonies before, so Haydn came here, and we have this famous number 6, 7, and 8 now, symphony, the
Matin, midi, soir.
Morning, lunchtime, and evening. And look up on the ceiling. That's what it is. We have L'Aurora, the goddess of sunrise, on the carriage. And yeah, we have here La Luna. And it's the evening, yeah? The evening goddess. And in the middle, this marriage on the Olympus. But it's noon.
God, that is incredible.
So, morning, noon, evening. Number 6, 7, and an 8 now.
Yeah. So the man himself is in here, he looks up at these pictures, how practical. Right, I'll write a piece of music about that one, then that one, and that one.
And in every movement, there are solo parts into it for his musicians. So
he's playing to the strengths of the particular hot musicians within the orchestra.
Yeah. So this was also very clever, because what did he do? He showed to the prince, you engaged perfect musicians. Look how wise you did. And to the musicians, he showed, I look after you, that you have perfect music to play, to show off in front of the prince, to show off what you really can do. And so, yeah, and this developed.
Prince Nicholas of Esterhazy could trust Haydn to keep him at the cutting edge of symphonic invention. But he also had a rather touching passion for an unusual and archaic instrument.
What is this wonderful instrument?
Well, it's called a baritone. It has 6 or sometimes 7 strings like this one. And they're tuned a little bit like a guitar or a lute. It's not easy to play. I mean, okay, if you play viol, there's one thing, but this thing...
Now, hang on a minute. This is a whole other set of strings behind the set of strings you were showing us.
Yes, and that can create problems. I mean, you have to work on that.
So you're playing with the thumb of your left hand
Yes.
on the strings at the back?
I plug them.
Oh, talk about multitasking.
That's it, and that's the problem about it. So you can accompany yourself in the worst case. For example, like this. And that's what makes the sound special, but what makes it a little hard to play. So there's not too many people trying to do that.
You know, had the prince not played the baritone, do you think Haydn would have written nearly so much music for the instrument?
I'm sure he wouldn't have written anything, because even in those times it was a very special instrument.
After just a few years at Esterhazy, Prince Nicholas rewarded him with the post of head of music, and Haydn was able to buy his first house just down the road from the palace.
This is his house where he lived. So, and he worked from here, and we have this little thing here.
Is that his piano?
Yeah, his forte piano. Anton Walter built this from Vienna. Was very famous at this time. I always say, please don't touch. Yeah. But
being as I'm with you, what do you think?
But I think we can manage this. So
fantastic.
Maybe you try. Have a try.
Wow. Beautiful, delicate little sound, just as you'd expect. They're such little perfect instruments, these Viennese fortepianos. This is a Walter, and I think I'm right in saying Mozart had a Walter as well.
Yeah, in his birthplace in Salzburg, they have a fortepiano. They thought it's an Anton Walter. And when this was restored, they found out it's from the same piece of wood.
No.
So they're brothers.
That is ridiculous.
And Haydn and Mozart are friends.
These two great masters, Haydn and Mozart, both own fortepianos, which are drawn from the same tree. That is quite remarkable.
A good coincidence, I think. Look at this picture, yeah? So
now that is the famous image of Haydn, isn't it?
He's a younger man, yeah.
Yeah.
He's on his fortepiano composing.
He's got a very kind face. Do you agree with that?
He himself said, I'm not a handsome man, but women loved me anyway. But he was good-humored, and I'm sure you could see this in his face, that he loved to talk with people, that he was in peace with himself. And I think this is very important to understand also his music. He struggled, of course, like everyone struggles in his life. And you can hear it in his music sometimes, but it always ends in peace and with hope. It's always a bright future at the end.
Well, it's a very interesting thing, because if you think about any piece of his music, of course it will have moments of melancholy, it will have moments of sheer high spirits, and lots of other things in between. But it never quite goes to that dark place that Mozart, say, does, where it's like he's gouging your soul out.
He is more grounded, I think so. Where he lived, He knew he has a place in life. Maybe Mozart traveled too much as a young boy. Didn't he have a home? Haydn had a home, and he had this region here. Of course, it wasn't so easy for him, but I think this is very important to understand. He wasn't torn apart.
In 1794, Haydn came to Britain for a second time with a visit that proved to be every bit as triumphant as the first, and again lasting about 18 months. Widespread public affection for Haydn hadn't diminished, especially amongst the ladies. Haydn, whose wife stayed home in Austria during these visits, once said that he couldn't understand how he'd been loved by so many pretty women, claiming they can't have been drawn by my beauty. Probably the most significant relationship Haydn had during his time in London was with the widow of the former master of the King's Music, herself a pianist, Rebecca Schroeter. Haydn later told his biographer that he would have married her very easily had I been free at the time.
Perhaps some of the youthful energy of this liaison with Rebecca Schroeter is reflected in the three great piano trios that Haydn completed on this second London visit and dedicated to her. For me, it was fascinating to find evidence of Mrs. Schroeter's intimacy with the older composer. Her signature on a contract that Haydn made with the London publisher at the end of his second visit, now housed in the British Library.
Simon, it looks, well, highly legal.
Well, indeed, it was a legal document, but I think it was gives us an idea of how Haydn was engaged with the commercial world in London. So what we've got here is an agreement with the publisher Hyde, and it's quite a long shopping list, actually. If you have a look at what he indicated he might write, symphonies, quartets, piano sonatas, piano trios, English songs, Italian songs, catches and glees, the whole range of different genres that might have been available at the time. And one of the things which is really interesting about this catalogue is that we've got here 3 grand symphonies, £100.
A lot of money.
That's a lot of money. But then you look over here and we've got 3 piano trios, as we would now call them. Much smaller scale pieces, easier and quicker to compose, £75.
So what we're talking about is the domestic music market, aren't we? Which I guess is a burgeoning thing here, the idea that your front room became your own little private concert hall.
Absolutely, and of course, we should bear in mind from the point of view of the publisher that if you sold a set of parts for symphonies, how many people across the country were going to be able to buy those parts and put on these symphonies? What really made the money was the music for the drawing room, and that was typically the piano music. The piano music was played by women, by the daughters of the household. It was an accomplishment that might lead you to the perfect husband, one might say. We see that, of course, in the novels of Jane Austen, for example. Or, on the other hand, songs. Very astute of Hyde to include some English songs in the list of pieces that he hoped Haydn might produce.
But also, presumably, rather astute of Haydn. Haydn could see here was a gaping need, and he's writing all these canzonettas, presumably with an eye on the money he was going to make.
Well, absolutely. And here we are again, if we just have a look at this here. 6 English songs with accompaniment for pianoforte, £75 again.
That's a remarkable amount of money to pay.
Sunbeams play on the green and glassy sea. Come and I will lead the way where the pearly treasures be. Come
This must have been amazing for Haydn, who'd been pretty much indentured all of his adult life, his professional life, to be coming and to be doing deals with a publisher in London, which were going to get him untold sums of money.
Well, Haydn, I must say, was a very acute businessman in that sense, almost too acute. He did tend to sell things several times around Europe. They didn't have the same copyright ideas that we have nowadays.
So you mean he could sell one piece to different people for different sums of money all at the same time?
As long as it was in a different country, that was kind of all right.
Follow, follow, follow me. Follow, follow, follow me.
In Britain and the rest of Europe, one of the great love affairs of the time was with all things Scottish. Here, Haydn cannily spotted another rich seam to mine and was easily persuaded to start work on commercial arrangements of Scottish folk song for the domestic market.
To what extent was this, well, Haydn's very vigorous publication of all these so-called Scottish folk songs, to what extent was it building this sense of the mythology of the north of Britain?
Oh, I think hugely. And of course, Haydn's just one of a whole handful of European composers who do this kind of job. A lot of publications appear in Scotland with local, much less well-known musicians doing arrangements. And then towards the end of the 18th century, Haydn does some arrangements for a London publisher, and then George Thomson appears on the scene, and he's the big daddy of this process. And to be honest, I don't know that either of them at that particular point realised how big a project this would end up being.
Would Haydn have actually heard authentic Scottish folk song and music?
Highly unlikely, I think, is the answer. I mean, Haydn sadly doesn't come north of the border, unlike some of the other composers who do set Scottish songs. But he does experience performances in London, and Scotch songs, as they're termed at that time, are really popular from the early 18th century. And they're popular on a really popular level, so they're performed at Vauxhall Gardens, they're performed in cantatas on the concert platform. But more importantly, a lot of these publications are created for domestic performance.
Should all the quanterns be forgot and never brought to mind? Should all the quanterns be forgot and auld lang syne? For auld lang syne, my dear, for auld lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for auld lang syne.
Auld Lang Syne is a very old tradition in Scotland as a song of parting, frequently sung at social events. Of course, the one that we sing and the one that we constantly refer to is the version that Robert Burns wrote.
We twa here in a boat, the brace and put the gowans fine.
Auld Lang Syne was just one of a staggering 400 Scottish folk songs that Haydn arranged to meet the positively insatiable public demand of the time.
Nowadays, I think a lot of people feel very negative about them. You know, what was Thomson doing asking Haydn to touch these melodies that he knew nothing about? How dare he? But at the time, I think what Thomson was doing, you know, was made perfect sense to him. You know, he was inspired by new European music and he loved his national music and he wanted to bring the two together.
Both Haydn's extended visits to Britain had been successes beyond his wildest dreams. Our streets really had been paved with gold for him. But the frenetic pace of London was eventually too much for the elderly composer, and in 1795 Haydn made a final parting. Now he wanted time to crystallise the ideas and experiences of these 4 years in some of his greatest late works.
Haydn spent the last 14 years of his life in Austria, riding high off the back of his successes in Britain, not least the money he'd made, which allowed him, amongst other things, to build this luxurious house on the outskirts of Vienna. But something that had really inspired Haydn about his time in Britain was their expression of nationhood through a single song. Britain was the first country to have a national anthem, and Haydn thought to himself, Austria needs one of these too. So he wrote one. God protect Emperor Franz. 2 years after leaving Britain, the master of form and structure also proved he could write an iconic tune. A melody which managed to survive not only the collapse of the Austrian monarchy in 1918, but even its appropriation by the Nazis. But the wealthy international celebrity didn't break his bonds with his employers at Esterhazy.
OK, so Haydn comes back from his great victorious successes in London. How's he now perceived?
He came back as the most famous composer of his time. So he got world fame, and he came back to this remote little town of Eisenstadt, and he had a new prince, the fourth Prince Esterhazy. Because he was so famous, they wanted to keep him. They wanted to connect his name to the Esterhazy family.
It's like having the crown jewels in your house, isn't it? Everyone's going to want to come and see.
Exactly. That was Haydn. Famous, and so the Esterhazys were famous. And he had only composed one piece per year for the Esterhazys.
Just one piece?
Just one piece. And
because in the past he'd composed so much, all the time, for the Esterhazys.
For that, yeah, but this, he still got money, so he had so much freedom. He had an income from them, he had a pension from them. It was like a life insurance.
Tell me about the Nelson visit.
It was 1800. Lord Nelson and Emma, Lady Hamilton, they came from Italy on the way back to London. It was a long way back home, and in Vienna they were there for a longer period. They were famous too, most famous couple. Yeah. And the Esterhazy, Prince Esterhazy, of course, wanted to have him in his castle, in his palace, because most famous person in his palace. Lord Nelson only came when the Prince Esterhazy guaranteed that Haydn will be here, because Lady Emma Hamilton wanted to sing with Haydn. The story goes that the prince was a little bit annoyed because Lady Hamilton was all the time with Haydn, and Lord Nelson was always playing cards. But they performed here the Mass. Haydn composed 2 years before, which is now the name has Nelson Mass.
Oh God, my appetite's completely better now. I've got to have a little go on this little peach of an organ, the organ that Haydn knew and played himself. A lot of men in Britain either have or would like to have a garden shed. It is a great British tradition, but not exclusively so. This is Haydn's garden shed on what were the outskirts of the 18th century Eisenstadt, a place where I imagine he could come for sheer peace and quiet, for repose, perhaps to spend time tending the garden, perhaps potting some seedlings, but just quietly to think and to open his mind. And it's in one of his last great works, The Creation, that we get a real glimpse into Haydn's inner world.
For me, that utterly ravishing sunrise that lies at the heart of Haydn's creation reveals a man who discovered, whilst in Britain, what it is to really look at the heavens. And it's fascinating to compare it with that far slenderer sunrise composed so many years before, when the brilliant young man arrived at Esterhazy and merely gazed at a painted ceiling. Although it was composed in Austria, I always think of the creation as a British work. It's based on an English text, but most importantly, it's an oratorio, that great British form developed by Handel for and with the British. But ultimately, I think it sums up Haydn's time here and his delight at completing the circle where art, science, and faith meet.
In the early morning of the 31st of May 1809, surrounded by friends, Haydn died peacefully at his home in Vienna. But Haydn's influence on our musical landscape extended far beyond any individual work. Like Handel before him, he seized the opportunities our nation offered. Big symphonies for increasingly popular public concerts, choral works to draw people together, music inspired by folk song, music for the home. Working and developing alongside us, Haydn left Britain a richer musical nation. Next week, in the final episode of The Birth of British Music, we'll see how Felix Mendelssohn redefined the power of music for a Victorian world.